The year is 1520, and you're standing in the shadows of Topkapi Palace, watching through gilded lattice screens as the most powerful man in 3 continents prepares for his nightly ritual. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, ruler of an empire that stretches from the gates of Vienna to the shores of the Persian Gulf, commands the loyalty of millions and the fear of European kings. But tonight, like every night, he must submit to rules so bizarre and intricate that they would make a modern person question the very nature of absolute power. The air is thick with jasmine incense and the whispered prayers of eunuchs who move like ghosts through corridors of marble and gold. You watch as the Sultan's most trusted advisors debate not matters of war or diplomacy, but whether his pillow should be positioned 3 finger widths or 4 from the edge of his sleeping platform. These are not mere customs or traditions. These are the invisible chains that bound even the Sultan himself, transforming the most intimate moments of his life into elaborate theatrical performances, where a single misstep could mean death. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power and protocol, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this, and please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The first rule that governed the Sultan's bedchamber was perhaps the most psychologically devastating of all. The ruler of the Ottoman Empire was forbidden from sleeping in complete darkness. This wasn't about fear or convenience. It was about the paranoid reality that absolute power creates absolute enemies. Every shadow could conceal an assassin. Every moment of vulnerability could be the last. 3 specially trained eunuchs were required to maintain a constant vigil throughout the night. Positioned at precise intervals around the royal bed, their eyes never closing, their attention never wavering. But here's where the true horror begins. These guards weren't just watching for external threats. They were watching the Sultan himself. Every movement, every sound, every shift in breathing was recorded in detailed logs that would be reviewed by the Grand Vizier each morning. The Sultan's sleep had become a matter of state security. His dreams subject to interpretation by court officials who believed that the ruler's subconscious mind might reveal divine guidance or dangerous weaknesses. Picture the psychological impact of this surveillance. The man who commanded the fate of nations could never truly rest. Even in his most private moments, he was performing for an audience of silent observers who cataloged his every vulnerable second. The weight of empire had transformed sleep itself into a form of public service, where the Sultan's body became property of the state even in unconsciousness. The second rule involved the Sultan's bedding, and it reveals the obsessive attention to detail that characterized Ottoman court life. The sheets, pillows, and coverlets were not chosen for comfort, but according to complex astrological calculations that determined which fabrics, colors, and textures would be most auspicious for the empire's future. Court astrologers worked in shifts, constantly recalculating the ideal sleeping environment based on planetary movements, seasonal changes, and political developments. Every thread was examined by specially trained servants who could detect the slightest imperfection that might disturb the Sultan's rest, and, by extension, the cosmic order itself. The silk was imported from specific regions of China, blessed by Islamic scholars, and woven according to patterns that supposedly channeled divine protection. The cotton filling was harvested during particular lunar phases and processed using techniques that had been passed down through generations of palace craftsmen. But the true madness lay in the daily replacement ritual. Nothing that had touched the Sultan's body during sleep could be used again. Each morning, the previous night's bedding was burned in a ceremonial fire. its ashes scattered according to religious protocols that were believed to prevent evil spirits from using the Sultan's sleeping essence against him. The cost was astronomical, but the psychological message was clear. The Sultan's comfort was so valuable that it could only be experienced once. The third rule governed the Sultan's sleeping position, and it demonstrates the intersection of religious devotion and political paranoia that defined Ottoman court culture. The ruler was required to sleep facing Mecca, but not directly. His body had to be positioned at a precise angle that honored the holy city while maintaining visual contact with the chamber's primary entrance. This meant that specially trained geometricians were consulted each night to calculate the exact positioning required based on the palace's orientation and the Sultan's location within his chambers. The complexity was staggering. Servants used measuring rods, compass instruments, and astronomical charts to ensure the Sultan's body achieved the perfect alignment. The bed itself was mounted on a rotating platform that could be adjusted to accommodate seasonal changes in the Earth's position relative to Mecca. What should have been a simple matter of lying down became an elaborate mathematical exercise that required the coordination of multiple specialists. The psychological impact was profound. The Sultan couldn't simply collapse into bed after exhausting days of governing an empire. Instead, he had to participate in a nightly ritual that treated his body like a sacred instrument that needed precise calibration. His personal comfort became secondary to cosmic and political considerations that transformed sleep into another form of imperial duty. The fourth rule involved the Sultan's nighttime attire, and it reveals the elaborate costume requirements that governed every aspect of royal life. The Sultan couldn't simply wear comfortable sleeping clothes. His nightwear had to be constructed from specific materials that had been blessed by religious authorities, sewn by craftsmen who had undergone purification rituals, and decorated with symbols that supposedly provided protection against supernatural threats. The garments were works of art in themselves. Silk robes embroidered with verses from the Quran, cotton undergarments dyed with pigments that had been prepared according to alchemical formulas, and slippers crafted from leather that had been treated with oils blessed by Sufi mystics. Each piece served both practical and mystical purposes, protecting the Sultan's body while maintaining his connection to divine authority. But the true horror was the fitting process. The Sultan couldn't dress himself. Teams of eunuchs had to clothe him according to precise protocols that determined which garment was put on first, how each piece should be adjusted, and what prayers should be recited during the process. The Sultan's body became a canvas for displaying imperial power, but he had no control over how that canvas was prepared. The fifth rule concerned the Sultan's pre-sleep purification rituals, and it demonstrates the religious obsessions that governed Ottoman court life. Before the Sultan could enter his bed, he had to undergo elaborate cleansing ceremonies that went far beyond normal Islamic ablutions. These weren't just about physical cleanliness. They were about removing the spiritual contamination that came from wielding absolute power over millions of human lives. The process began hours before bedtime with ritual baths that used water from 7 different sacred sources. Each source had been blessed by different religious authorities and was believed to cleanse specific types of spiritual pollution. The Sultan's body was washed with soaps that had been prepared according to medieval alchemical formulas, using ingredients that had been gathered during particular lunar phases and processed by craftsmen who had undergone years of religious training. The psychological impact was devastating. The Sultan was constantly reminded that his power came with spiritual costs that required nightly purification. He couldn't simply govern during the day and rest at night. Instead, he had to participate in elaborate rituals that treated his political authority as a form of contamination that needed to be cleansed before he could safely sleep. The sixth rule involved the Sultan's bedtime prayers, and it reveals the performative nature of Ottoman religious devotion. The Sultan wasn't allowed to pray privately. Instead, his nightly prayers had to be conducted in the presence of court officials who ensured that every word was pronounced correctly and every gesture was performed according to established protocols. These weren't moments of personal spiritual connection. They were state ceremonies that transformed private devotion into public performance. The prayers themselves were elaborate compositions that had been crafted by court theologians to address the specific spiritual needs of imperial rule. They included requests for divine guidance in governing the empire, protection against foreign enemies, and forgiveness for the moral compromises that absolute power required. The Sultan had to memorize these lengthy compositions and recite them perfectly, knowing that any mistake would be interpreted as a sign of spiritual weakness or divine disfavor. The presence of witnesses transformed prayer into performance. The Sultan couldn't simply commune with God. He had to demonstrate his piety for an audience of officials who would report on his spiritual condition to the broader court. His relationship with the divine became another aspect of statecraft, subject to political interpretation and governmental oversight. The seventh rule governed the Sultan's bedtime reading, and it demonstrates the educational requirements that never ended, even in the privacy of the royal bedchamber. The Sultan was required to study specific texts each night, chosen by court scholars who believed that continuous learning was essential for effective rule. These weren't recreational reading materials. They were carefully selected works of theology, philosophy, and statecraft that were designed to reinforce the Sultan's fitness for absolute power. The reading list was updated constantly based on current political challenges and religious considerations. If the empire faced military threats, the Sultan would study works on military strategy and the history of successful campaigns. If there were religious disputes, he would focus on theological texts that addressed the relevant controversies. If there were diplomatic challenges, he would review works on statecraft and international relations. But the Sultan couldn't read alone. Court scholars were required to attend these study sessions, ready to provide commentary and ensure that the Sultan understood the political implications of each text. What should have been private intellectual exploration became another form of supervised education, where the Sultan's learning was monitored and guided by his advisors. The eighth rule involved the Sultan's dreams, and it reveals the supernatural beliefs that influenced Ottoman political culture. The Sultan was required to remember and report his dreams each morning to court interpreters who analyzed them for political guidance and divine messages. These weren't casual conversations about interesting dream imagery. They were formal sessions where the Sultan's subconscious mind was treated as a source of governmental intelligence. The dream interpreters were highly educated specialists who had studied traditional Islamic dream symbolism, Ottoman political history, and the personal psychology of their ruler. They maintained detailed records of the Sultan's dreams, looking for patterns that might reveal divine guidance or warnings about future challenges. The Sultan's sleeping mind became another tool of statecraft, subject to professional analysis and political interpretation. The psychological pressure was immense. The Sultan couldn't simply forget his dreams or dismiss them as meaningless mental activity. Instead, he had to remember them clearly enough to provide detailed reports that would be analyzed for their political implications. His subconscious mind became another aspect of imperial performance, subject to scrutiny and interpretation by government officials. The ninth rule concerned the Sultan's awakening process, and it demonstrates the elaborate protocols that governed every transition in the royal daily routine. The Sultan couldn't simply wake up naturally. Instead, his awakening had to be carefully orchestrated by court officials who ensured that he transitioned from sleep to consciousness in a manner that was appropriate for his divine status. The process began before dawn, with specially trained musicians who played specific compositions designed to gradually bring the Sultan to consciousness without startling him. The music was carefully calibrated to his natural sleep cycles, which had been studied by court physicians who monitored his rest patterns. The Sultan's awakening became a performance that required the coordination of multiple specialists. As the Sultan gradually awakened, servants would adjust the lighting in his chamber, slowly increasing the illumination to ease his transition from darkness to daylight. The temperature would be regulated to ensure optimal comfort, and the air would be scented with specific perfumes that were believed to promote mental clarity and spiritual purity. The Sultan's emergence from sleep became an elaborate production that treated his consciousness as a valuable resource that needed careful management. The 10th rule involved the Sultan's first words upon awakening, and it reveals the scripted nature of Ottoman royal communication. The Sultan wasn't allowed to speak spontaneously when he first woke up. Instead, his first words had to be specific prayers and proclamations that had been approved by court theologians and political advisors. These weren't expressions of personal feeling or casual morning greetings. They were formal statements that reinforced the Sultan's divine authority and political legitimacy. The approved morning statements included prayers of gratitude for surviving the night, proclamations of loyalty to Islamic principles, and declarations of commitment to just governance. The Sultan had to memorize these formulas and recite them perfectly, knowing that his first conscious words would be reported throughout the court and interpreted as indicators of his spiritual and political condition. The psychological impact was profound. The Sultan couldn't even experience the natural human process of gradually becoming alert and oriented. Instead, he had to immediately assume his role as a divine ruler, whose every word carried political significance. His transition from private individual to public figure began the moment he opened his eyes. The 11th rule governed the Sultan's morning inspection of his chamber, and it demonstrates the security paranoia that characterized Ottoman court life. Before the Sultan could leave his bed, specially trained guards had to conduct a thorough examination of his sleeping quarters to ensure that no threats had materialized during the night. This wasn't a quick security check. It was an elaborate investigation that treated the Sultan's bedchamber as a potential crime scene. The inspection process involved multiple specialists who examined every surface, object, and hiding place for signs of intrusion or sabotage. The bedding was checked for foreign objects. The walls were examined for new cracks or holes that might indicate surveillance, and the air was tested for unusual odors that might suggest the presence of poisons or other chemical threats. The Sultan's private space became a security zone that required constant professional monitoring. The Sultan had to remain in bed during this inspection, unable to begin his day until the security specialists had declared his chamber safe. His morning routine became contingent on the findings of professional investigators who treated his bedroom as a potential battlefield. The paranoia that protected him also imprisoned him, making every private moment subject to security considerations. The 12th rule involved the Sultan's selection of his daily attire, and it reveals the political implications of royal fashion choices. The Sultan couldn't simply choose clothes that he found comfortable or attractive. Instead, his wardrobe selections had to be approved by court advisors, who analyzed the political messages that different garments would convey to various audiences. The decision-making process was incredibly complex. Court officials had to consider the Sultan's scheduled activities, the political climate, religious considerations, and the symbolic messages that different colors, fabrics, and styles would communicate. The Sultan's clothing became a form of political communication that required careful planning and professional expertise. The Sultan's personal preferences were secondary to political considerations. If he preferred certain colors or styles, those preferences had to be balanced against the political implications of his choices. His body became a canvas for displaying imperial power, but he had limited control over how that canvas was decorated. The 13th rule concerned the Sultan's breakfast, and it demonstrates the elaborate protocols that governed royal nutrition. The Sultan couldn't simply eat foods that he enjoyed or that satisfied his hunger. Instead, his meals had to be prepared according to complex dietary theories that balanced religious requirements, medical considerations, and political symbolism. Court physicians worked with Islamic scholars and political advisors to design menus that would maintain the Sultan's health while reinforcing his divine authority. The foods were chosen for their supposed effects on mental clarity, physical strength, and spiritual purity. The Sultan's nutrition became a matter of state policy that required professional oversight and religious approval. The meal preparation process was incredibly elaborate. The ingredients had to be sourced from specific regions, prepared by craftsmen who had undergone purification rituals, and served using utensils that had been blessed by religious authorities. The Sultan's breakfast became a religious ceremony that required the coordination of multiple specialists. The 14th rule involved the Sultan's morning correspondence, and it reveals the administrative burdens that began before he even left his bedchamber. The Sultan couldn't simply wake up and gradually prepare for his day. Instead, he had to immediately begin processing urgent communications from across the empire while still in his sleeping attire. Court secretaries would bring carefully organized bundles of documents that required the Sultan's immediate attention. These included military dispatches, diplomatic communications, religious rulings, and administrative decisions that couldn't wait for regular business hours. The Sultan's bedroom became an extension of his office, where matters of state intruded on his most private moments. The psychological burden was enormous. The Sultan couldn't experience the normal human transition from sleep to wakefulness. Instead, he had to immediately assume responsibility for governing an empire that spanned 3 continents. His personal needs became secondary to the constant demands of imperial administration. The 15th rule governed the Sultan's departure from his bedchamber, and it demonstrates the ceremonial requirements that transformed simple actions into elaborate performances. The Sultan couldn't simply get up and leave his room. Instead, his departure had to be conducted according to specific protocols that honored his divine status and maintained appropriate security measures. The departure process involved multiple ceremonies that had to be performed in the correct sequence. Religious prayers, security inspections, wardrobe adjustments, and administrative briefings all had to be completed before the Sultan could move to the next phase of his daily routine. His transition from private space to public areas became a theatrical production that required careful choreography. The Sultan's freedom of movement was completely constrained by these ceremonial requirements. He couldn't respond to personal impulses or spontaneous desires. Instead, every action had to be planned, approved, and executed according to established protocols that treated his body as a valuable resource that required professional management. The 16th rule involved the Sultan's interaction with his personal servants, and it reveals the hierarchical relationships that governed Ottoman court life. The Sultan couldn't simply communicate with his attendants as human beings. Instead, all interactions had to follow strict protocols that maintained appropriate social distances and reinforced the Sultan's divine authority. The servants couldn't speak to the Sultan unless specifically addressed, and even then their responses had to follow prescribed formulas that avoided any appearance of familiarity or disrespect. The Sultan's personal relationships became formal exchanges that prioritized protocol over human connection. The psychological isolation was profound. The Sultan was surrounded by people who served his every need but couldn't relate to him as a person. His most intimate moments were attended by individuals who were required to treat him as a divine figure rather than a human being. The very people who knew him best were forbidden from acknowledging his humanity. The 17th rule concerned the Sultan's physical exercise, and it demonstrates the elaborate requirements that governed royal health maintenance. The Sultan couldn't simply engage in physical activities that he enjoyed or that provided natural exercise. Instead, his fitness routine had to be designed by court physicians who balanced medical considerations with religious requirements and political symbolism. The exercise regimen was incredibly complex. Different activities were prescribed for different times of day, seasons, and political circumstances. The Sultan's physical movements were analyzed for their effects on his health, their compliance with Islamic principles, and their symbolic messages about imperial strength and vitality. The Sultan's body became a political instrument that required professional management. His personal preferences for certain activities were secondary to expert recommendations about what forms of exercise would best serve the empire's interests. His physical fitness became a matter of state policy that required constant monitoring and adjustment. The 18th rule involved the Sultan's personal hygiene, and it reveals the religious obsessions that governed Ottoman court culture. The Sultan couldn't simply maintain cleanliness according to personal preferences or practical considerations. Instead, his hygiene routines had to follow elaborate protocols that combined Islamic purification requirements with supernatural beliefs about the spiritual implications of physical cleanliness. The purification process was incredibly detailed. Different parts of the Sultan's body had to be cleansed using specific techniques, materials, and prayers that were believed to remove not just physical dirt, but spiritual contamination. The Sultan's personal cleanliness became a religious ceremony that required the participation of multiple specialists. The psychological impact was significant. The Sultan couldn't simply wash himself efficiently and move on to other activities. Instead, he had to participate in elaborate rituals that treated his body as a sacred object that required special care and attention. His personal hygiene became another form of imperial performance that prioritized symbolic considerations over practical efficiency. The 19th rule governed the Sultan's personal possessions, and it demonstrates the elaborate protocols that surrounded royal property. The Sultan couldn't simply own objects in the normal sense. Instead, his possessions had to be managed according to complex systems that balanced security concerns, religious requirements, and political symbolism. Every object in the Sultan's possession had to be catalogued, blessed, and monitored by court officials who ensured that nothing could be used to threaten his safety or compromise his spiritual purity. The Sultan's personal property became a matter of state security that required constant professional oversight. The Sultan's relationship with material objects was completely mediated by court officials who made decisions about what he could own, how his possessions should be maintained, and when they should be replaced. His personal preferences were secondary to security and religious considerations that prioritized institutional needs over individual desires. The 20th and final rule involved the Sultan's preparation for the following night's sleep, and it reveals the cyclical nature of Ottoman court protocols. The Sultan couldn't simply end his day and naturally transition to rest. Instead, his evening routine had to be carefully planned and executed according to the same elaborate protocols that had governed his morning awakening. The preparation process began hours before bedtime, with consultations involving court astrologers, physicians, security specialists, and religious advisors who coordinated the complex arrangements required for another night of monitored sleep. The Sultan's rest became a state project that required the participation of dozens of specialists. The psychological burden was enormous. The Sultan couldn't simply feel tired and go to bed. Instead, he had to participate in elaborate preparations that treated his sleep as a matter of imperial importance. His most basic human needs became governmental responsibilities that required professional management and constant oversight. As you stand now in those same shadowed corridors where we began, older and wiser and infinitely more aware of the costs of absolute power, you understand that the strange bedroom rules of the Ottoman Sultans were never really about comfort or convenience. They were about the systematic transformation of human beings into living symbols of divine authority, where every private moment became a public performance and every personal need became a matter of state policy. The Sultan, who commanded the loyalty of millions and the fear of European kings, was himself a prisoner of the system that elevated him. He had gained the power to shape the destiny of empires, but had lost the freedom to experience the simple human pleasure of falling asleep naturally. His authority over others had cost him authority over himself, creating a golden cage where divine power came at the price of human autonomy. The elaborate protocols that governed his nights weren't just strange customs or historical curiosities. They were the visible manifestation of a system that understood power as a form of performance, where legitimacy required constant demonstration and authority demanded eternal vigilance. The Sultan's bedroom had become a theater where the drama of absolute rule was performed for an audience of officials who monitored every moment for signs of strength or weakness. These strange bedroom rules of the Ottoman Sultans reveal a world where absolute power created systems of control more complex than any European court. From the silent choreography of the harem to the elaborate rituals that governed every intimate moment, these practices shaped an empire that lasted over 600 years. The women who navigated these invisible chains showed remarkable resilience, finding ways to survive and sometimes thrive within impossible circumstances. While these traditions may seem alien to us today, they remind us that power has always sought to control the most private aspects of human experience, and that throughout history, people have found ways to preserve their dignity even in the most oppressive systems.